What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a build video for Dragon Age the Veilguard, specifically the one I used for my first playthrough and that I really enjoyed. So when I first started playing Dragon Age the Veilguard, I knew I wanted to chase down the type of build that I've enjoyed throughout the rest of the Dragon Age games, which was a fairly melee-oriented spellcaster, which is what the Spellblade is all about. Now this is a specialization for the Mage on top of some gear and everything else that gives us a very specific playstyle. That is to say, mid-range spell combat focused largely on applying afflictions, detonating our mage's arcane bomb, as well as a little bit of battlefield control, and setting up our companions to detonate enemies with our primers that we've put on them. Along the way, picking up some equipment that increases the stagger we inflict on enemies, and we'll have a whole host of options for simply shutting down enemies before they really get much of a chance to do anything in return to us. Now, as with any build, this pretty much starts at character creation, and there's just a few notes here. For the most part, you're pretty wide open, but I did want to mention a couple things. Now, naturally, we do need to pick the mage class, obviously, that's pretty mandatory, but then we also have our faction choice. Now, honestly, I would tell you just right away, pick the one that makes the most roleplay sense for you, but there are some things I wanted to mention here, which are that factions do in fact give you damage bonuses to certain groups of enemies and have little effects. Now, the damage bonus is most useful in the form against Venatori and Darkspawn, as they show up the most, which coincides with either the Shadow Dragons or the Grey Warden. So if you're looking for just like maximum effectiveness, I would pick one of those two, but again, it's not a huge deal, especially with the game's modular difficulty, so do feel free to pick whichever one makes sense to you the most. Speaking on that difficulty though, while this build can start out a little bit on the slow side just as we gather up equipment, gear, abilities, etc., it does get extremely strong later, and so you should have no problems playing this on higher difficulties once you kind of learn the general moveset. But with that stuff in mind, let's talk about exactly what we're going to need for this particular character. Now, kicking it off with the mage skill tree in particular, let's talk about what to pick up when and some of the abilities to focus on. Now, right away, you do have some wiggle room here. Ultimately, we're going to have 50 just regular skill points and then even more that we can pick up from a statue to increase that count. So we're going to have more skill points than we need, especially by the time we hit the game's max level of 50. But the first thing I want to draw your attention to is just the core elements of the class. So mages are able to toggle between two different weapon sets, a spellblade or a mage knife alongside an elemental orb plus a staff. The staff is for ranged abilities, whereas the spellblade is obviously melee, but you also have an orb equipped at the same time that with light attacks allows you to maintain a sort of mid-range approach to combat. Now that's important because we need to know when to use each one of those effectively. There are things you have to hit in range in this game, so knowing when to swap to your staff is very helpful, but melee is also important here because we're going to need to hit things in melee or with our knife specifically in order to detonate our arcane bombs, which we're going to ideally want to do with our spirit blade that we're going to get later on. But these weapon sets also provide us a bit of variable defense. With our staff equipped, we will throw up a big orb that absorbs damage for us, whereas with our orb and dagger, we need to time it appropriately to effectively parry enemies that try to hit us. So it's important to know how your defense works. But with that out of the way, let's actually start talking about this. Now, the ability we're going to start with is Arcane Shot. This is going to take up a good chunk of mana, but deals a pretty solid projectile blast attack. We're going to use this for much of the early game. It will, however, become a bit outdated a little later on, especially once we start picking up things like Chain Lightning, which should be one of your first abilities you grab, as this hits multiple targets if they are there, plus applies Overwhelm, which is a primer, and is generally useful for the damage as well as applying shock to the enemy it hits. We also want to come over to this side though and grab Wall of Fire. This is our control ability that's also going to allow us to hit enemies with fire. So this throws up a wall of flame, enemies inside of it get hit with burned, of course, and also dealt fire damage. It's also important to note though that Wall of Fire does not cost mana, it costs a cooldown timer, meaning that we can use it outside of our mana and how that affects our other skills. So those three abilities are going to make up the bulk of what we're doing initially. However, we are going to make our way into some other abilities. Coming down here towards the Spellblade specialization, we get Storm Surge. This is likely going to replace Arcane Blast for you because it both hits enemies with electric damage, applying shock to them. Shock and burned are our primary effects afflictions here. So it hits everybody in that area and then also flings our character back a ways. This is important for a good bit of movement on our end to quickly extricate ourselves from a situation that might otherwise be a little too dangerous for a mage. As again, ideally you want to be operating at roughly mid-range in order to be effective. Now later on still, once we actually grab our specialization, we're going to swap out our ultimate ability for Thunderous End as it applies a shock and deals our appropriate electric damage. And while we're going to pick up Void Blade as part of this specialization for an ability as well, it's important to note that I personally didn't enjoy using this one a ton. I preferred Storm Surge, but if you would like to swap those two out, this should be perfectly fine, as they do similar things, but this one also detonates the Sundered Condition, which might be conditionally more useful for a particular character that you happen to want to build. Now that's sort of our general abilities out of the way, so let's talk more about the passives and things we're going to get specifically. Now right away, I would say grab the skills in your core little area here first. So we're going to pick up things like Mortal Concentration, which allows us to perform a ranged attack with our staff that will break through barriers much more easily on certain enemies. Jump attacks guaranteeing criticals is mostly a side effect of us needing to get to Wall of Fire quickly. There is Phage Strike, which allows us to dodge and then immediately attack out of that. That can be very useful for maintaining movement and momentum. We also grab Quick Recovery here. This is great for getting our mana up faster after we spend it, or taking just damage in general, because how much mana we can maintain is going to dictate how often we get to use some of our main abilities. And then Mind Blast. This is great for giving you some room with staff in particular, so it allows you to, at the cost of mana, simply blow enemies back a few meters and give you some room to breathe, which can be useful for a mage. Now, otherwise, what we're going to want to do is make our way down to the Spellblade specialization from our core tree. That means coming down here where Wall of Fire is, where Chain Lightning is, and then converging in the middle onto these skill points before making your way down there. Now, you're almost certainly going to hit this right here before you hit level 20, which is the level at which you can take your specializations. So that's when we're going to start creeping up this way on the skill tree before filling out the specialization that we can, and then moving back here before moving up to the left of the skill tree before moving out specialization as it becomes available. Because this side of specialization becomes available at level 30, whereas from here on it'll be level 40 or vice versa. It flip-flops depending on which one you grab first. So that's important to know, but let's talk about some of the most important skills to pick up along the way. Starting with Essence Eater, a greater passive. When we perform takedowns, we get health back as well as ultimate generation. So when we stagger enemies, ideally using weapons and things with high stagger, we'll get some of our ultimate back as well as be able to heal. That's just generally useful. And then in the middle here, we get our medium armor mastery. I suggest trying to get here relatively quickly, and we're going to be using medium armor, of course, because we get all of these bonuses for wearing it to our critical damage, our final damage for our combos, charged attack damage if we're going that route, which is useful for ranged attacks, and then agile attacks as well. So basically we get a whole host of benefits here for simply wearing medium armor once we grab this. Now right here we get imbued reaction. So every time we perfectly block, we will trigger shocking weapons. This adds electric damage to our weapons, of course, dealing extra damage, and is just generally pretty useful. And then we also get Energy Burst down here as well. Anytime we deal fire or electric damage, we also increase the damage of the other type by 15% for 10 seconds. And in the late game especially, we're going to be alternating a lot of this damage type, which is a huge buff for us. Now, another thing you might want to grab before you start moving down towards your specialization, though, is the Degrade Greater passive. This allows us to deal 5% bonus damage for each unique primer and affliction on our target, which we're going to be dealing a lot of, especially in combination with our companions. So that can get you a fair bit of extra damage straight away. Now, moving down here a little bit towards Storm Surge, let's talk about some of these other passives. We're going to grab the ones that upgrade our strike abilities because that's primarily the abilities we're going to be using, whereas these other ones we're not grabbing upgrade our blast abilities, which we aren't really using. So this one causes any critical hit with our strike abilities to grant us Quickened, which allows us to refresh our cooldowns on abilities much faster. This will keep us using Wall of Fire in particular much more quickly. And then over here on the other side, we get Staggering Strikes. This allows our abilities to deal more stagger damage, which we're going to stack with equipment to deal much more than we normally would. And then right before we get to our our specialization, one of the most important ones for us to grab is Spirit Blade. Spirit Blade allows us to combo light attacks into a heavy attack with our dagger and orb in order to throw out a blade. This blade will trigger our class's innate arcane bomb mechanic, meaning that we can charge enemies with our arcane bombs only to detonate them with one of our core combos, which is what we're going to be attacking with outside of our individual cooldowns or waiting for mana from our other abilities. This, in combination with some stuff later, is going to form the bulk of our sort of rotation, so to speak. Now, moving over here a little bit, we can also grab Debilitating Shocks, giving us less damage from enemies who are shocked, which ideally will be all of them. And then over here, I like to get basically everything except the actual ability because it's all very useful, such as Reclamation, giving us mana after defeating enemies, upgrading our strike abilities again to apply shock not only to enemies we hit, but also to nearby enemies. Catalyst, causing our projectile abilities, which we have a few of, such as Chain Lightning, causing them to, upon defeating an enemy, giving us Rally Party, which increases the damage we are dealing. Down here, we can grab things like Nexus Shock. Once we have so many stacks of shocked on an enemy, we can start dealing electric damage that will strike enemies within range as well, a sort of passive Chain Lightning, basically. And then over here, we can just deal more damage to enemies with strike abilities for each stack of shocked we have on them. And then with this one, we deal more damage to enemies that are farther away from us. And then while later on in our progression, we're still going to get some great passives as well, such as this one over here, which will be one of the last ones you grab, which deals extra stagger to enemies with an affliction, or light attacks generating us additional mana as we go, which is doubled against enemies that have an affliction, which we'll be inflicting a lot of. And then later on, we can grab Flames of Inspiration, which allows us to defeat burning enemies to grant us Rally Party, and even increase our stacks of burning. But in order to make the most use of that, we first need to grab some of the passives from our specialization. Now remember, we do kind of need to pick a side here, because these two are going to require a certain minimum level, 30 or 40, depending on which side you grab first. So let's talk about them each individually. On the right side here, we have Arcane Strike, which causes our strike abilities to hit with Arcane Bomb as well, which is useful for us. We have Veil Flurry, which is somewhat similar to Spirit Blade, but it instead hits a wide area around you if you hold the light attack after instead of hitting with a heavy attack, which can be useful when you are surrounded, to be sure, as it does hit multiple times. And then we can also increase our maximum shocked and burning stats. But one of my favorites is actually electrical burns here, because this allows us to apply burning when we apply shocked and vice versa. Basically, applying one will apply the other, which can give us some great damage and also, of course, chain react to all of the other passives which are working off of our afflictions. And what's more, with Shocking Tactician here, once we achieve the maximum shocked stacks, which is very easy to do with electrical burns, we also trigger a damage burst in that area around the enemy, which is fantastic for us. Now on the other side though, we can pick up Spirit of Vengeance. This allows us to throw Spirit Blade twice, rather than having to restart the combo after the first time, and then we can pick up the passives for causing our Arcane Bombs to jump onto other enemies when we defeat enemies that have more than one. And then of course, Orbital Burst. This one allows us to, when triggering an Arcane Bomb, also deal damage in a 6-meter radius around that target, as well as increasing the stagger damage we deal to enemies. So that is kind of the stuff we're looking at in terms of skills to pick up. And you can of course see here all of the general ones that I picked out for this. Do remember though, if you make a mistake or anything, you can absolutely simply back up, refund, and do whatever you want in order to get this done in any order you please. So if you ever feel like you made a mistake or you want to try a different combo before you get to the end of your progression, you can refund these freely and, redistribute them as you please. So from there, let's talk a little bit about gear. Now, as I mentioned, we do need to be wearing medium armor as well as medium helm in order to make the most of our medium armor mastery. Otherwise, it doesn't go into effect. But let's talk about some of the gear we have picked out here. Now, early game, in a city called Treviso, you can find a unique spellblade there just by exploring, called the Point. This will carry you through most of the game, and it is a great early game weapon, but unfortunately, it's not perfect for us either, which is why just finding a spellblade with the best stats, or the stats that you want in particular, is going to help you out. So such as this enchanted knife here, which grants us extra mana, as well as extra mana on hit, but also causes abilities to cost more mana and deal more damage as a result. Whereas I really liked this spellcaster's stiletto in the long run because this allowed me to cause Arcane Bomb and each stack of it in particular to reduce incoming damage, by 10%. But really there's no, I would say, perfect answer here, just pick the one that suits your playstyle the most. Now our orb, on the other hand, is going to have an element associated with it, as they all deal a certain type of damage. Now personally, I really enjoyed this Fadelight orb, specifically because it dealt a different type of damage than the rest of my kit, which could give us a little bit of variety, but also because it deals an immense amount of stagger damage, while increasing our healing, defense, and the damage we deal against raw health. But if you instead wanted to focus on an orb that, say, upped your burning damage or your electrical damage, that would be a perfectly good way to go as well. In particular, though, I do actually think the Mage Gambit Arcane Orb is fantastic for us as well, because it deals the electric damage type and also increases fire and electric damage while it's at it, triggering some of those cascading effects from all our afflictions. So if you wanted to go like absolute best route, I would consider Mage's Gambit that personally, but it's not the only option, is my point. Now, on the staff side of things, we're really not going to be using the staff a ton unless we just need to give ourselves some distance or we're hitting a target that specifically has to be hit at range, which happens every once in a while. So it really is just dealer's choice there. Now, in terms of armor, I personally came to like the Garb of Kinship the most, as it increases our damage and the duration of all our advantages, which is to say just beneficial status effects, which we will be applying more than a few of as we go. It also heals us as we gain those advantages, which I found really useful, and in comparison, the other medium armors available to us just weren't very compelling, but you do have a couple other options. Now, for your headpiece, I don't actually have this one fully upgraded here, but the Anointed Ash Vitar for the Kunari, which is all they can wear, which increases all your affliction, damage, and duration, etc., is really the way I liked to go because of everything it did for our afflictions in particular. But that's kind of the idea of the things you want to be stacking here. Now, your belt is very important because it increases the healing that you're going to receive from your potions, and I liked this one because it allows us to both trigger Quicken, which as a reminder increases our ability cooldowns, gives us extra ability damage, increases our base damage when we use a potion, and when we use any ability while quickened, we also heal for a bit then as well. So it's just a very versatile belt for what we're doing, but you do have a lot of choices when it comes to belts and how they affect how you heal in total. But for our necklace and accessories, anything that increases stagger damage here is especially helpful. There's also the brass root ring, which increases our shocked damage, and we're going to be applying a ton of shocked to the enemy, so that's fantastic for us. But having a ring that also increases the stagger you deal, which can come from the ring that just increases stagger generally, or this unique ring, Call of the Hall, which does that but also gives us a random advantage on a takedown and can be enchanted with strike ability damage, was great for me. I really enjoyed that one. So that is kind of what you're looking at in terms of gear. Now, if you're unaware, the way you get this upgraded is that you're going to find these versions of gear in their common variant. As you find more instances of this gear, it's going to upgrade in rarity, and then you will upgrade the power of it, the +1 through 10, by going to the Caretaker in the Lighthouse. So initially, these items, when you find them, won't be quite as good, but over the course of the game, you'll upgrade them to get them to this particular point. From there, though, let's talk about the runes. So I personally love Ravage. This gives us a passive increase against health of enemies, that is to say once their barrier or armor is gone, plus we can use it as an active ability to increase our damage massively against health. So we can quickly burn away their armor or barrier with our abilities, and then smash into them quickly with an activated Ravage rune, and really decimate their health. But in addition to that, I enjoyed the Besiege one, which gave us increased damage against barriers, and Surge, which gives a bunch of mana regeneration, which is useful for always making sure we can hit something. Now, there honestly is no right or wrong answer with runes. They're very adjustable to your playstyle thanks to their passive and active abilities, so kind of dealer's choice there, to be honest. But that's kind of generally what I approached that particular bit of content with. Now, from there, let's talk about how that actually plays out in combat. Well, basically, combat comes down to applying, of course, all of our abilities, spamming our combos, our Spirit Blade, our Veil Flurry, etc., to hit enemies as much as possible, apply Arcane Bomb, apply our status effects, and then trigger those things and our AoE bursts from applying all those stacks of afflictions onto enemies, dealing as much damage both up front and over time as we possibly can when we combine those things. Now, the trick here is twofold. For one, it's best if you can learn how to play around with the middle range of distance between you and the enemy, because honestly, you don't want them too close because it's going to interrupt your combos, and while a single strike of your your dagger will in fact set off any arcane bombs, you also need to apply that arcane bomb via your orb. Not to mention a lot of our abilities that I like to use here play around with that space as well, both in terms of Wall of Fire burning enemies while you obviously don't want to be right up next to them, but also Chain Lightning to hit enemies gathered around you, but also Storm Surge allowing you to move back if enemies get too close while damaging them at the same time. So getting used to and understanding how to play around with the distance between you and the enemy at any given time is crucial to making this work effectively so you don't get torn to pieces. So anything that helps you stay mobile on that front is going to help you out a lot, which is why I like Storm Surge over the other abilities I could replace it with. So we're dealing all that damage, we have all those effects, we break through larger enemies' armor or barrier, and then we can trigger Ravage, ideally to give us that huge boost to health damage, and then trigger all of our abilities and everything to coalesce all of that into a massive moment, which is great for just our main character. But obviously, it's not just our main character out there. We're going to have at least 2 companions with us, and we don't want them standing around and doing nothing. Now, realistically, Harding and Lucanus are in fact the best options to travel with you most of the time, and this is because their abilities often detonate what we've set up. So we can use them to detonate the primers that we have applied to the enemy simply by performing all of these actions at the same time, which is going to allow them to be effective in addition to just their regular abilities. Now, Lucanus in particular is helpful because he can do this while also attacking enemies in a way that either does extra damage to barrier or armor at the same time, typically while also applying the Sundered effect as well. And some of their abilities can even apply a high amount of stagger themselves, which is certainly something to know. But I think overall, with all of that said, you probably get the gist of how this particular build plays, and hopefully you try it for yourself and enjoy it. But I think for this video, that is pretty much going to wrap it up. So if you happen to try this out or you've tried something similar, I would love to hear about it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.